Marcus Johnson's fingers hovered over his laptop keyboard, his heart pounding against his ribs as he read Mrs. Blackwood's essay prompt for the third time. Discuss the current state of racial equality in America, supporting your position with personal experiences and historical context. He glanced around the pristine classroom, taking in the designer bags casually slung over chairs and the latest MacBooks decorating nearly every desk. At Riverside Prep, he was one of only 6 black students in the entire junior class, a fact that felt especially heavy today. Remember, Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through the silence, her pearl necklace catching the fluorescent light. This essay counts for 30% of your final grade. Her eyes lingered on Marcus for a fraction too long, making his skin prickle. Don't let her get to you, he thought. You've earned your place here, scholarship or not. Mrs. Blackwood? Chelsea Martinez raised her hand, her voice trembling slightly. Could we maybe write about something less controversial? The teacher's lips curved into what Marcus had come to recognize as her privileged smile. My dear, if you find equality controversial, perhaps that's worth examining in your essay. A few students chuckled, but Marcus caught Chelsea's eyes and saw his own discomfort reflected there. They were the only scholarship students in advanced English, and they both knew what it meant to navigate these halls carefully. You have 1 week, Mrs. Blackwood continued. I expect nothing less than excellence from my AP students. Excellence. The word echoed in Marcus's mind as he remembered his first day in her class, when she'd asked him if he was sure he hadn't wandered into the wrong room. During lunch, Marcus sat alone in the library, opening his notebook to a fresh page. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Education is the one thing they can't take from you, boy. But Lord, will they try. Working through lunch again, Mr. Johnson? Marcus startled at Mrs. Blackwood's voice. She stood over him, examining his notes with poorly concealed disdain. Yes, ma'am. I want to do well on this essay. Admirable, she said, her tone suggesting anything but admiration. Though I must warn you, emotional arguments won't earn you points in my class. We deal in facts here. Marcus's jaw tightened. Yes, ma'am. I understand. As she walked away, he pulled out his phone and opened the video he'd been saving. An interview with his grandfather from 1965, describing his experience during the Selma marches. His hands trembled as he pressed play. They beat us for wanting to vote, his grandfather's younger self said, voice strong despite his bloody bandages. But they can't beat the truth out of history. That evening, Marcus stayed late in the computer lab, researching deep into the night. The janitor, Mr. Washington, paused his cleaning to read over Marcus's shoulder. Powerful stuff you're writing, son, he said softly. Thanks, Mr. Washington. I just hope it's good enough. The older man's face darkened. Let me tell you something about Eleanor Blackwood. 20 years ago, before she married into money and changed her name, she was Eleanor Jenkins, the same teacher who tried to get me fired for not knowing my place. Marcus's head snapped up. What? Mr. Washington nodded grimly. Be careful with this essay, son. Some people don't want certain stories told, no matter how well you tell them. As Marcus packed up his things, his mind raced. Mrs. Blackwood's earlier comments suddenly took on a new, more sinister meaning. But instead of fear, he felt a surge of determination. Opening his laptop one last time, he typed out his title, The Price of Silence: How America's Inequality Persists Through Educational Gatekeeping. Let's see you grade this one fairly, Mrs. Blackwood, he thought, his fingers flying across the keyboard as the truth he'd been holding back all semester finally broke free. He didn't notice Mrs. Blackwood watching from her darkened classroom, her manicured fingers already composing an email to the school board about concerning behavior from one of their scholarship students. The clock read 2:37 a.m. as Marcus rubbed his burning eyes, surrounded by scattered research papers and empty coffee cups. His grandfather's voice, recording played softly from his phone, a testament to struggles that felt both distant and painfully present. We weren't fighting just for ourselves, his grandfather's voice crackled. We were fighting for you, Marcus, for your generation. And here I am, Grandpa, Marcus thought, still fighting the same battles, just in different rooms. His phone buzzed, a text from his father. Son, get some sleep. Your mother's worried. Marcus typed back, Almost done, Dad. This one's important. The response came quickly. They're all important. But you matter more. Tears pricked at Marcus's eyes as he remembered his father's words from last week. We can't afford to lose this scholarship, son. The factory's cutting jobs and your sister's college fund. I won't let you down, Marcus whispered to the empty room. Any of you. His essay had evolved beyond a simple assignment. Each paragraph felt like a punch against the invisible walls that surrounded him at Riverside Prep. He wrote about his grandfather's scars, both visible and hidden. About his father working double shifts to buy his first laptop. About the way Mrs. Blackwood's eyes always seemed to find him whenever she discussed underperforming demographics. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His sister Tanya stood in the doorway, still in her waitressing uniform. "You're still up?" she asked, dropping her bag. "Let me see what's got my little brother breaking curfew." "Tanya, it's not finished." But she was already reading, her expression changing from curiosity to anger to pride. "Marcus," she breathed, "this isn't just an essay. This is fire." He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "It's probably too honest. Mrs. Blackwood wants facts, not emotions." "Facts?" Tanya scoffed. "Like the fact that she asked me if I was lost when I dropped off your lunch last week? Or the fact that she accidentally marked your last paper down a full grade?" "You don't understand," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "I have to play it safe. Dad's job is exactly why you need to write this," Tanya interrupted. "You think Grandpa played it safe in Selma?" Marcus stood up, pacing. "That was different. They were fighting for basic rights. I'm just trying to pass English." "Are you?" Tanya challenged. "Because this essay isn't about passing English. It's about breaking silence." As if on cue, his laptop pinged with an email notification. From Mrs. Blackwood. Subject: concerning your recent behavior. Marcus's heart stopped. "She's been monitoring my school account activity." "What?" Tanya grabbed the laptop, reading aloud. "It has come to my attention that you've been accessing civil rights archives and social justice websites using school resources. While I encourage research, some of these materials might be considered inflammatory." "She's trying to intimidate you," Tanya growled. Marcus slumped in his chair. "Maybe I should pick a different topic." "Like hell you will." Tanya's voice was steel. "Open your grandfather's box." "What?" "No, those are private. Open it." With trembling hands, Marcus retrieved the old shoebox from under his bed. Inside lay yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, and a small leather diary. "Read it," Tanya insisted. Marcus opened the diary to a random page and began reading. "They threaten my job today. My children's safety. But silence is a slow death, and I choose to live." His vision blurred with tears as he continued reading. But when he looked up, Tanya was holding her phone, recording. "What are you doing?" "Making sure your voice is heard," she said firmly. "Just like Grandpa's was." "Stop. If this gets out, then what?" "The truth finally comes out about how they treat us? About how people like Mrs. Blackwood keep their power." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed again. Another email from Mrs. Blackwood. "Upon review of your current academic standing, I've scheduled a meeting with the scholarship committee for tomorrow morning. Attendance is mandatory." Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. But as he looked at his grandfather's diary, then at his essay, something shifted inside him. "You know what?" he said, turning back to his laptop. "I'm going to finish this essay. But first," he opened a new document and began typing. "Dear School Board." What neither Marcus nor Tanya knew was that at that very moment, Mrs. Blackwood was discovering something that would change everything. Her own grandfather's name in Marcus's research, listed as one of the most notorious segregationists in their county's history. The scholarship committee meeting had gone exactly as Marcus expected. A perfectly orchestrated performance of concern about his academic focus and attitude. Now, sitting in Mrs. Blackwood's classroom, he watched her dramatically remove his essay from her designer briefcase. "Just breathe," he told himself. "Whatever happens, you told the truth." "Mr. Johnson," Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through the tension. "Would you care to explain this manifesto to the class?" Several students shifted uncomfortably. Chelsea Martinez caught his eye, her expression a mix of sympathy and fear. "It's not a manifesto, Mrs. Blackwood," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady. It's my essay on equality as assigned. She smiled, that same cold, privileged smile. Really? Because what I see is a personal attack on this institution and its values. She began reading aloud. The walls of privilege are often invisible to those who built them, but they cast long shadows over those forced to live in their shade. The class fell silent. Marcus could feel his heartbeat in his throat. While your metaphors are creative, she continued, this reads more like a social media rant than academic writing. F. The red letter seemed to burn through the paper. Marcus stared at it, remembering his father's words about the scholarship, his sister's double shifts, his grandfather's sacrifices. Mrs. Blackwood, he started, his voice stronger than he felt. I followed every guideline. I cited historical sources, included personal experiences. Personal experiences? She interrupted. Like your unfounded accusations about institutional bias? Your inappropriate investigations into faculty backgrounds? She knows about the research, Marcus realized. She knows I found out about her grandfather. The truth isn't inappropriate, he said quietly. The classroom temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Washington, Mrs. Blackwood called out to the janitor passing by. Perfect timing. Please escort Mr. Johnson to the principal's office. But Mr. Washington didn't move. Instead, he stepped into the classroom, his worn boots squeaking on the polished floor. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice carrying decades of restrained dignity. I think you might want to reconsider that grade. Excuse me, she sputtered. This is completely inappropriate. What's inappropriate? Mr. Washington continued, pulling out his phone. Is this email chain I found in the school's archived server. The one where you and certain board members discussed ways to manage the scholarship demographic. The color drained from Mrs. Blackwood's face. How dare you access private? Nothing's private when it's on a public school server, he interrupted. 20 years as head of maintenance gives you time to learn the system. Just like 20 years of watching history repeat itself gives you the wisdom to recognize when enough is enough. Marcus sat frozen, watching the scene unfold. Other students had their phones out, recording. This is absurd, Mrs. Blackwood snapped. I'll have your job for this, like you tried to have it 20 years ago? Mr. Washington asked quietly. Before you married into the Blackwood family and reinvented yourself? The bell rang, but nobody moved. Class dismissed. Mrs. Blackwood barked, her composed facade cracking. As students filed out, Marcus gathered his things, his hands shaking. Mr. Washington placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Your essay, the older man said, reminded me of another paper I read long ago, written by a young Eleanor Jenkins before she became Mrs. Blackwood, about the shame of discovering her grandfather's role in fighting against integration. Marcus's head snapped up. What? Mr. Washington nodded grimly. She wrote about wanting to change things, to make amends for her family's past. Funny how money and power can make people forget their own truth. As they left the classroom, Marcus heard Mrs. Blackwood's muffled sobs. But when he glanced back, he saw her furiously dialing her phone, her hands shaking with rage rather than remorse. What none of them knew was that Chelsea Martinez had already uploaded the entire classroom confrontation to her YouTube channel, where it was about to go viral, along with copies of both essays. Marcus's current piece on equality, and a young Eleanor Jenkins's long-buried cry for redemption. Marcus's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 3 million views and counting. I didn't want this, he muttered, watching Chelsea's video rack up another 1,000 comments. His essay, Mrs. Blackwood's meltdown, and most devastatingly, her own long-buried essay about her grandfather, all laid bare for the world to see. Tanya burst into his room, her waitressing apron still on. Have you seen the news? CNN wants an interview. This isn't what I wanted, Marcus repeated, his voice cracking. I just wanted to write the truth. Sometimes, Tanya said softly. The truth has other plans. His phone rang, Dad. Marcus's stomach dropped. Son, his father's voice was tight. We need to talk. Mr. Blackwood just called the factory. He's threatening to pull his company's contracts unless... The silence hung heavy. Unless what, Dad? Unless you publicly retract your essay and apologize to his wife. Marcus felt the room spin. Their entire family's livelihood versus his principles. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. Silence is a slow death. A text from Chelsea popped up. Turn on Channel 7 now. The local news was showing footage from outside Riverside Prep. Hundreds of students, not just from their school, but from across the city, were protesting. This is bigger than one essay now, the reporter was saying. Students are sharing their own stories of discrimination, and the hashtag #TruthOverPrivilege is trending nationwide. Another call came in. Principal Roberts. Marcus, she began, her usual confidence wavering. The school board is meeting in emergency session. Mrs. Blackwood's husband is demanding your immediate expulsion. Can they do that? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Money talked, especially in private schools. They can try, Principal Roberts said, surprising him. But they'll have to explain why they're expelling a student for following an assignment's guidelines while ignoring 20 years of documented discrimination. Suddenly, Mr. Washington's voice came through on the other line. Ma'am, you need to see this. The Blackwood's daughter just posted something. Marcus quickly found Lily Blackwood's Instagram post, a tearful video of her reading from her mother's old journals. My mom used to be different, Lily's voice trembled. Before she married into money, before she became obsessed with status. She taught me that our family needed to make amends for our past. But somewhere along the way, she became what she once fought against. I am sorry, Marcus. I'm sorry it took your courage to remind us of who we're supposed to be. The post had already been shared thousands of times. Marcus's phone buzzed again, an email from Yale University's admissions office. Dear Mr. Johnson, in light of recent events, they want to offer you a full scholarship, Tanya breathed, reading over his shoulder. They're saying your essay exemplifies their values of truth and social justice. Before Marcus could respond, another notification appeared, a public statement from the Blackwood Corporation's board of directors. In light of recent events, we are launching a full investigation into discriminatory practices. Mr. Blackwood has been placed on administrative leave. A new scholarship fund for minority students will be established. Marcus sat heavily on his bed, overwhelmed. How did this get so big? Because you weren't the only one waiting for someone to speak up, Tanya said, showing him thousands of similar stories flooding social media. You just happened to be the first. His phone rang again, Mrs. Blackwood's number. Marcus stared at it, his finger hovering over the answer button. You don't have to take that, Tanya warned. Yes, I do, Marcus said quietly. Because this isn't about revenge. It's about change. He answered the call, but before Mrs. Blackwood could speak, a man's voice came through instead. Hello, Marcus, the unfamiliar voice said. This is Richard Blackwood III, Eleanor's father-in-law. We need to talk about your grandfather and what really happened in Selma. The phone nearly slipped from Marcus's hand as he realized. This went deeper than anyone knew. The Blackwood estate loomed before Marcus like a monument to old money and older sins. Richard Blackwood III stood in the doorway, his silver hair and tailored suit a sharp contrast to Marcus's worn jeans and scholarship pride t-shirt. Thank you for coming, the older man said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. There's something you need to see. What am I doing here? Marcus thought, following Richard through halls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. This could be a trap. In the study, Richard unlocked an antique desk. Your grandfather, he began, his hands trembling slightly, William Johnson. He saved my life in Selma. Marcus froze. What? I was there as a journalist, Richard explained, pulling out a yellowed envelope. Young, naive, thinking I could remain neutral while documenting history. Until the beating started. He spread old photographs across the desk. Marcus's breath caught. There was his grandfather, younger but unmistakable, shielding a bloody Richard Blackwood from police batons. Your grandfather pulled me to safety, Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. Told me there's no such thing as neutral when it comes to justice. That day changed everything for me, except my cowardice. I don't understand, Marcus said. If you changed, why did you let your family? Because I was weak, Richard interrupted. I used my money to protect my conscience instead of fighting for change. I watched my son become everything I despised, watched Eleanor transform from an idealistic teacher into this. A notification lit up Marcus's phone, another viral video. This time, it was Mrs. Blackwood at a press conference, tears streaming down her face. "I betrayed everything I once believed in," she was saying. "I became the very thing I once fought against, and I hurt countless students in the process." "She's trying to save herself," Marcus muttered. "No," Richard said quietly. "She's finally remembering who she was. But there's more." He pulled out a thick folder. Every scholarship student she's failed. Every demographic management meeting. Every time the board chose money over morality. "I kept records of everything." "Why?" Marcus demanded. "Why didn't you stop it?" "Because exposure without evidence changes nothing," Richard replied. "Your essay was the match, Marcus. This is the gasoline." Marcus's hands shook as he read through the documents. "This could shut down the whole school. Or transform it," Richard countered. "The question is, what do you want?" Before Marcus could answer, his phone buzzed again, a message from Chelsea. "Marcus, they're threatening to revoke all minority scholarships if you don't back down. We need help." Richard read the message over Marcus's shoulder. "They're scared. Good. Now we can really change things." "We?" Marcus asked skeptically. "Your grandfather saved more than my life that day," Richard said. "He saved my soul. I've spent 30 years hiding behind my wealth instead of honoring that debt. Not anymore." He pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Send them in." The study door opened, revealing Mr. Washington, Principal Roberts, and a team of lawyers. "The Blackwood Foundation is being restructured," Richard announced. "New leadership, new mission. Equal opportunity education. Real change, not just PR statements." He turned to Marcus. "We need a student voice on the board. Someone who understands both sides of the divide. Someone who can write truth to power." Marcus's mind raced. "Why should I trust you?" Richard smiled sadly. "You shouldn't. Trust the evidence, trust your instincts, and make us earn your trust, just like your grandfather taught me." As if on cue, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID read, "William Johnson." "Grandpa?" Marcus answered, his voice shaking. "Hello, Richie," his grandfather's strong voice replied. "It's been 30 years. Time to finish what we started in Selma." Marcus looked up at Richard Blackwood, who had tears in his eyes. What he saw in that moment wasn't a wealthy businessman, but a scared young journalist being beaten on a bridge in Alabama, saved by a brave man who taught him that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of violence. But neither Marcus nor Richard knew that at that very moment, Mrs. Blackwood was making another decision, one that would shake the foundations of everything they were trying to build. The factory parking lot was eerily empty when Marcus arrived with his father. The "closed until further notice" sign hung like a death sentence over hundreds of families' futures. "They actually did it," Marcus's father whispered, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel. "They shut down the whole plant. This is my fault," Marcus thought, the weight of guilt crushing his chest. "All these families." His phone buzzed with messages from laid-off workers' children, his classmates, his neighbors, his community. Some supportive, others blame-filled. "Marcus Johnson?" A reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "How do you respond to Mrs. Blackwood's claim that your essay has destroyed the local economy?" Before he could answer, his father stepped forward. "My son told the truth. If telling the truth destroys your economy, maybe it needed destroying." "Dad," Marcus thought, "you don't have to. They think they can silence us with poverty," his father continued, his voice growing stronger. "That's how they've always done it. Take away our jobs, our homes, our dignity. But they can't take our truth." More cameras appeared, more microphones, more laid-off workers gathering around. "Mr. Johnson," Chelsea's mother stepped forward, still wearing her nurse's scrubs. They just canceled all their contracts with the hospital too. 300 staff members laid off. The crowd grew larger, angrier. Marcus felt the situation slipping out of control. Then, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" Mrs. Blackwood stood at the edge of the parking lot, her designer clothes replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her daughter Lily stood beside her, holding a thick folder. "Eleanor," Marcus's father said coldly, "haven't you done enough damage?" "No," she replied, her voice breaking. "I haven't done nearly enough, but I'm starting now." She opened the folder, pulling out documents. These are the real reasons for the factory closure. My husband's been embezzling money for years, using these layoffs to cover his tracks. The plant's not closing because of Marcus's essay. It's closing because of corporate greed. The crowd fell silent. Why should we believe you? Chelsea's mother demanded. Because I have proof, Mrs. Blackwood replied, handing the documents to a reporter. And because I'm done being part of the problem. Lily stepped forward. Mom found these last night, when she threatened to expose everything, Dad. She choked back tears. He threatened to destroy us all. Marcus watched Mrs. Blackwood, really looked at her, and saw something he'd never noticed before: fear. The same fear he'd seen in scholarship students' eyes. The fear of losing everything. They're trying to divide us, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Rich against poor, black against white, worker against worker. But the real divide has always been between justice and power. His phone buzzed again. Richard Blackwood III was calling. He put it on speaker. The board has voted, Richard announced. My son is removed as CEO. The plant will reopen under employee ownership. The hospital contracts will be reinstated with better terms. A cheer went up from the crowd, but Marcus noticed Mrs. Blackwood trembling. Eleanor, Richard continued, your husband's actions are his own. Your position at the school awaits you, if you're ready to be the teacher you once were. She looked at Marcus, tears streaming down her face. I don't deserve. This isn't about deserving, Marcus interrupted. It's about choosing. Who do you want to be now? Before she could answer, police cars swarmed the parking lot. Mr. Blackwood emerged from one of them, his face contorted with rage. Arrest them all, he shouted. They're trespassing on private property. But as officers approached, they weren't heading toward the crowd. Instead, they walked straight to Mr. Blackwood, handcuffs ready. James Blackwood, one officer announced. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. What nobody noticed was Chelsea quietly uploading another video. Not of the arrest, but of a private conversation she'd recorded earlier that morning between Mr. Blackwood and certain school board members, plotting something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The school board meeting room crackled with tension as Chelsea's video played on the projector screen. Mr. Blackwood's voice filled the silence. These scholarship kids are getting too comfortable. Time to remind them of their place. Start with the Johnson boy. Make an example of him. Marcus watched the board members' faces, some pale with shock, others dark with shame as their own voices joined the conspiracy. How deep does this go? He wondered. How many lives have they ruined? Principal Roberts stood, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. In light of this evidence, I move to dissolve the current board immediately. You can't dissolve us, Board Chairman Phillips sneered. We are this institution. No, Richard Blackwood III interrupted, entering with a team of attorneys. You're at shame, and you're finished. Chelsea stepped forward, her usual timidity replaced by steel. I have more recordings. Years of them. My mother cleaned your houses, and you never thought to check her phone? Did you? Never thought the help's daughter would be smart enough to gather evidence. The room erupted in chaos. Board members shouted accusations. Lawyers exchanged documents. Reporters scribbled frantically. Mrs. Blackwood sat quietly in the corner, watching her old world crumble. Marcus approached her hesitantly. Why didn't you stop them? He asked softly. She looked up, tears in her eyes. Because I was a coward. Because it was easier to be Eleanor Blackwood than Eleanor Jenkins. Because privilege is comfortable, Marcus finished. Until it suffocates you, she whispered. Suddenly, the doors burst open. FBI agents entered, followed by state education officials. This investigation just went federal, the lead agent announced. We've uncovered similar patterns at private schools across 5 states, all connected to the Blackwood Foundation. Richard Blackwood III stepped forward. I can explain. Dad, don't. Lily's voice cut through the room. She held up her phone, displaying emails and bank statements. I found Mom's old files. This goes back to Grandpa's time. The foundation wasn't created to help minorities. It was created to control them. Marcus felt the floor shift beneath him. Everything, his scholarship, his struggle, his family's hopes, had been part of a larger, darker design. The truth, his grandfather had told him, isn't always what we want it to be, but it's always what we need it to be. Principal Roberts cleared her throat. I have something to add. She pulled out a recorder. I've been documenting everything since I became principal, including this morning's attempt to bribe me into silence. The recording played. Chairman Phillips offering her $1 million to discredit Marcus and bury the evidence. You refused, Marcus realized. Some things are worth more than money, she replied. Like looking in the mirror and recognizing who you've become. As the FBI began leading board members away, Chelsea's mother stepped forward, still in her cleaning uniform. For years, she said, her voice trembling, we cleaned your offices, served your meals, raised your children. We heard everything, saw everything, and now, finally, everyone else will too. The media exploded with questions, cameras flashing, reporters shouting. But Marcus noticed something strange. Mrs. Blackwood was smiling. Eleanor? Richard asked warily. I just remembered something, she said, pulling out an old leather diary. My grandmother's journal. The real reason the Blackwood Foundation was created. She opened it to a marked page and began reading. Today, my husband thinks he's created a system to control them. What he doesn't know is that I've ensured it will eventually destroy itself. Sometimes, the only way to break a cycle of oppression is to let it grow so large it collapses under its own weight. The room fell silent. Your grandmother, Marcus breathed. She built it to fail? She built it to reveal, Mrs. Blackwood corrected. And she left instructions for when it did. She handed Marcus an envelope, yellowed with age but sealed with fresh wax. On the front, in elegant script, was written, to be opened when truth finally breaks the chains of privilege. As Marcus reached for it, a shot rang out. Through the window, they glimpsed a figure running, someone they all recognized but nobody expected. The envelope fell, splattered with blood. The hospital waiting room buzzed with tension as Marcus stared at the blood-stained envelope in his hands. Mrs. Blackwood was in surgery. The bullet had missed her heart by inches. You should open it, Lily whispered, her eyes red from crying. That's what Mom would want. But what if this makes everything worse? Marcus thought, his fingers trembling over the seal. The news played silently on the waiting room TV. Board Chairman Phillips in handcuffs, caught at the airport with a gun matching the ballistics. His final, desperate attempt to keep the past buried had only exposed it further. Marcus carefully opened the envelope, and a century of secrets spilled out. Dear future, the letter began. If you're reading this, then the system my husband built to oppress has finally become the tool of its own destruction. The Blackwood Foundation was never meant to last. It was meant to reveal. Chelsea leaned forward, reading aloud. Every scholarship, every rejection, every act of discrimination was documented. Every student they broke, every dream they crushed, all carefully recorded. Not to celebrate their power, but to ensure their eventual accountability. Marcus's grandfather wheeled himself into the waiting room, his strong voice carrying decades of wisdom. Sometimes the best way to fight injustice is to let it show its true face. Richard Blackwood III looked up, tears streaming down his face. All these years, I thought I was protecting my family's legacy. Instead, I was part of its greatest shame. No, Marcus's father interjected. You were part of its redemption. You chose truth over power. That's a new legacy. A doctor emerged from surgery. Mrs. Blackwood is asking for Marcus. In the recovery room, Eleanor Blackwood looked small against the white sheets. Did you read it? She whispered. Marcus nodded. Your grandmother, she planned everything. She knew, Eleanor smiled weakly, that someday someone would be brave enough to write the truth. She just didn't know it would be a scholarship student who taught her granddaughter-in-law how to be human again. The door opened. FBI agents with more questions, reporters seeking statements, lawyers with documents to sign. Wait, Eleanor called out. There's one more thing. She gestured to her purse. Inside was a USB drive. Everything, she said. Every private school in the country that used our model. Every board member. Every deleted email. Every covered-up complaint. The whole system of educational apartheid exposed. Marcus stared at the tiny drive. Why now? Because you showed me that change doesn't come from hiding truth to protect power. It comes from speaking truth to destroy it. The next morning, headlines exploded across the nation. Private schools scrambled to address decades of discrimination. Scholarship programs were reformed. Board members resigned. The educational landscape began to shift. At Riverside Prep, Marcus stood at the podium during assembly, his essay in hand. "We talk about equality," he began, "but talk is cheap. Real change costs something. Sometimes it costs everything we thought we were to become what we're meant to be." In the audience, Chelsea and her mother sat beside Lily and Richard Blackwood III. Mr. Washington stood with Principal Roberts. His father and grandfather watched proudly from the front row. "My grandfather once said that silence is a slow death," Marcus continued. "But truth? Truth is a resurrection." As he spoke, news alerts buzzed through the audience. The Department of Education was launching a nationwide investigation. The Blackwood Foundation was being restructured into a true equal opportunity organization. Mrs. Blackwood had been appointed to a federal commission on educational reform. Marcus finished his speech to thunderous applause, but as he stepped down, his phone buzzed with one final message. An email from Yale. "Dear Mr. Johnson, in recognition of your role in exposing systemic discrimination in private education, we would like to offer you a full scholarship. However, we first need your help addressing similar issues within our own institution." Marcus smiled. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. And somewhere, in an old leather diary, a long-dead woman's words still echoed. "The truth doesn't hide forever. It waits for the right voice to speak it."